The Committee on Homeland Security Subcommittee on Oversight, Investigations, and Accountability will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare the committee in recess at any point. The purpose of today's hearing is to investigate the recent influx of inadmissible migrants from the People's Republic of China to the United States borders. Without objection, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Pfluger, the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Higgins, and the gentleman from New York, Mr. Swazi, are permitted to sit on the dais and ask questions of the witnesses. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Today's subcommittee hearing will examine the unprecedented numbers of Chinese foreign nationals crossing the border and whether this represents a risk to Homeland Security. I think we have a visual. And there it is. Border Patrol records show that from 2007 to 2021, encounters of Chinese nationals illegally entering the United States at the southwest border were relatively rare, averaging a little over 1,000 per year. That changed dramatically under the Biden administration, rising from 1,970 in fiscal year 2022 to 24,048 in fiscal year 2023, an 1,100% increase. In the last 7 months, from October to April, Border Patrol has already encountered 27,496 Chinese nationals, shattering last year's total. At this pace, the full fiscal year will see encounters of illegal Chinese immigrants 2,300% higher than the rate just 2 years ago. This is a national security concern, and it's not a new one. 1 year ago, the current Border Patrol Chief and then Del Rio Sector Chief Jason Owens testified in a transcribed interview with the committee that, quote, even without the increase, people coming from the PRC would be of concern to me. That's always going to be a group we look at more closely and work with our partners with FBI to make sure they don't pose a threat, end quote. I agree that there is a serious national security concern, and we should be looking closely at individuals coming from communist China, the United States' greatest adversary on the world stage. Unfortunately, under the Biden administration, Border Patrol agents have been instructed that when processing Chinese nationals, they should conduct short, basic interviews that include only generic background questions instead of in-depth interviews. In other words, there is no serious vetting. These questions simply ask about military service, education, birthplace in China, employment, and political affiliation with the CCP. While agents only proceed to an in-depth interview if one of the answers in the basic interview is flagged, it begs the question, how likely is it that someone showing up at the border is going to admit that they are here to do the bidding of the Chinese Communist Party or perhaps the People's Liberation Army? Instead, that person will likely provide the answers their smugglers told them to give Border Patrol, just give the right answers and come right on into the homeland. These limited interviews, combined with a lack of reliable information from China to verify biographical claims and limited translation services, severely constrain CBP's ability to conduct rigorous vetting for criminal and national security concerns. One Border Patrol sector chief told the committee that it could be difficult to determine the motives of those detained who come from distant countries like China, stating that, quote, we try our best to figure out why they're coming, but of course, that information can be hidden. Their agendas, their ideologies, the reason for them coming could be missed, close quote. This is especially true for gotaways, those who avoid apprehension and who reportedly pay as much as $60,000 to be smuggled illegally into the United States. Some of you may have seen some news made, I think just yesterday, finally a document emerging verifying that the number of gotaways in total is quite large. I think it's about 1.7 million, if I remember correctly, across the Biden administration. But among them, presumably there are some number of Chinese nationals, if the numbers that are showing up at the southwest border is any indication. The government has no idea who the gotaways are or why they are crossing the border and deliberately trying to avoid Border Patrol. But something tells me the motive isn't likely to be above board. Some Chinese nationals may be motivated to seek asylum on legitimate claims of persecution, such as Uyghurs from Xinjiang, but it is more likely that they come for economic reasons or other motives that do not meet the statutory requirements for asylum. And considering the Biden administration's failure to hold China to account, these Chinese nationals also know that it is very unlikely they will ever be returned to China under this administration's policies, even if ordered removed by an immigration judge. Some Chinese nationals may have more nefarious motives for coming to the United States. For example, federal indictments in North Carolina from last month show partnerships between Mexican drug cartels and Chinese transnational criminal organizations engaged in money laundering operations throughout the United States. This was reinforced by testimony from federal counter-narcotics officials in a Senate hearing 2 weeks ago that Chinese criminal organizations have, quote, emerged as the professional money launderers of choice for Mexican drug traffickers, end quote. Recent reporting has also uncovered that Chinese-run marijuana farms are all across the United States, and many of them exploit workers from China. Transnational criminal organizations and the CCP see our open border as opportunity. This surge of Chinese nationals at our border without recent precedent presents a major national security vulnerability ripe for exploitation. It makes no sense that the Biden administration refuses to take common sense steps to secure our border in the face of such obvious threats to our homeland. Instead, we get more of the same catch and release policies that have set the country on this dangerous course for the past 3 years, and all that some can say is that the Congress should codify and institutionalize these very practices. I want to thank our witnesses for being here today, and I look forward to their testimony. Well, excuse me a second. Get to the part where I recognize you. I now recognize the ranking member, the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Ivey, for his opening statement.
I was going to say that might be sufficient, actually. Just,
I figured there was something else in there I probably should read, but you're exactly right. That was easy enough.
Well, I thank
Mr.
the chairman for that. It's May. This is the month when we typically celebrate and honor the culture, heritage, achievements, and contributions of Asian Americans, Native Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. And I want to make sure that we honor those contributions and steer away from any kind of concerns or rhetoric with respect to, I want to make sure that our friends from the Asian communities are not mischaracterized or misunderstood by who they are and what they're doing. There's a lot of rhetoric, I got to say, that I hear recently. I've got, for example, despite the invasion rhetoric some Republican colleagues are spreading, it's only a tiny fraction of border crossers who are coming from China. In the first 4 months of this fiscal year, less than 2.5% of border crossers were Chinese nationals. In fact, Chinese nationals are neither one of the fastest growing nationalities apprehended along the southwest border, nor one of the top 10 nationalities apprehended at the U.S. border. I've seen and heard rhetoric. People are Chinese. We've got Chinese immigrants coming across the border to, quote, build an army. One statement was made without any evidence that, quote, it's virtually certain, close quote, that some Chinese border crossers are spies. One Republican's comments calling Chinese immigration an invasion. And I think that's the kind of rhetoric we want to steer away from. I do think it's important to say this. They've got people crossing the border for a variety of reasons. I think part of it's economic, as the chairman referenced. Part of it, and we've had some hearings with respect to the Uyghurs. It's a bit ironic that this subcommittee's held hearings about that, and it goes to the repression of the Uyghurs and in some instances forced labor or slave labor. And I want to make sure that we keep those sorts of pressures in mind, in addition to the national and international migration patterns that are at reference here. And I think we should keep in mind some of the comments that the Border Patrol chiefs have made. We had recent conversations with them. Here's what they did say about Chinese border crossers. One statement, that specific demographic doesn't cause me concern, close quote. Another one, we treat everybody the same. It doesn't matter where they come from. It doesn't matter what your nationality is, what your religious beliefs are. We're going to treat everybody exactly the same. They run through the same screening, the same processing, the same background checks. Everything we have access to, we are going to check on each and every person. There's another exchange question. Do you know what reasons Chinese nationals are given in their interviews for coming? Answer, the typical reason is the same as for most migrants, for work or a better life. So, let's keep all that stuff in mind as we sort of work our way through this. And I think a big piece of where we ought to be going is legislation. I was not a full fan of the Senate bill that was proposed a few months ago by Senator Langford and others, but I thought it was a big step in the right direction. I was very disappointed that former President Trump essentially killed the bill, an opportunity to work on the legislation, by statements he made publicly and the adoption of those positions by the Speaker here and most of our House Republicans in general. And I would say this, I know I've had colleagues on this committee and then on the Judiciary Committee raise concerns about the legislation that was proposed from the Senate, but I would just remind my colleagues that we have this amendment process here. And if we bring up legislation in the committee, they can offer amendments to address it. And guess what? They're the majority on not only both committees, but on the overall floor as well. So they could adopt amendments if they wanted to, but instead of moving forward and working on this type of legislation, whether they think it needs to be amended or not, they're not bringing it up, and we're focusing on other things instead. I was heartened to see that Connecticut Senator Chris Murphy stated, I think yesterday, well, it may have been earlier today, that he wants to renew the push for the bipartisan legislation that was proposed in the Senate. And I think that's a great idea because it addresses some of the concerns that are underlying this particular hearing: the need for more border agents, the need to make the process work faster, the need to get more judges who can adjudicate these cases more quickly, because that'll help to address some of the problems that we're facing, I think, at the border and with the migration patterns. And I also think that the funding piece is important. I know there's a lot of times I've heard comments that the resources don't matter, at least from my Republican colleagues, but when we get testimony from Border Patrol agents, even in this committee, they always say, yeah, we need more resources. We don't have enough people to cover the border. We don't have enough money to retain many of the people that we have. They leave to go do other things and get paid larger salaries for less rigorous work. We don't have as many judges as we need to handle all these cases. So I'm hoping we can address those things as well. So I want to thank the panel for being here today. I look forward to your testimony, and not necessarily that I'm going to agree with everything or you're going to agree with everything I say or that you'll even agree with each other. That's not necessarily the point. But I do appreciate the fact that, and I thank the chairman for this, bringing in people who can shed light on what's going on down there. There's a lot of partisanism around this, and that goes with the territory. This is not only Washington, D.C., but Capitol Hill. But I think we need to hit a point, and we did this with the subcommittee hearings we had with respect to the Uyghurs, and I raised African countries that had forced labor going on there as well. We've shown we can do it, and I'm hoping we can do that again here in this instance, and ultimately find our way to legislation that can address the overall problems, not just with respect to Chinese migrants, but all of the issues at the border as well. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Ivey. Other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. And I'm pleased that we have a distinguished panel of witnesses before us today to examine this topic. And I ask that our witnesses please rise and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you will give before the Committee on Homeland Security of the United States House of Representatives will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record reflect that the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. Thank you. You may be seated. And I'd like to formally introduce you for the hearing. Mr. Simon Hankinson is a senior research fellow in the Heritage Foundation's Border Security and Immigration Center. He previously served for more than 20 years in the State Department as a Foreign Service officer. Mr. Craig Singleton is a senior fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, where he also serves as senior director in the China program. Dr. Meredith Oyen is an associate professor of history at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. And Mr. Todd Bensman is an author and journalist currently serving as senior national security fellow at the Center for Immigration Studies. I thank all of the witnesses for being here today, and we'll now hear from the witnesses to summarize your statements for 5 minutes each, and I recognize Mr. Hankinson for that purpose for 5 minutes.
Chairman Bishop, Ranking Member Ivey, members of the committee. I served as a Foreign Service officer in 7 countries. I've adjudicated thousands of visa applications to facilitate lawful visits and immigration while excluding aliens who were legally inadmissible. The visa process overseas stands in total contrast to what happens at the U.S. border today. Over the past 2 years, I visited the border in Arizona, California, New York, and Texas. I saw nationals of many countries apprehended by the Border Patrol. In San Diego last March, I watched Border Patrol dropping off dozens of aliens, including Chinese, at a bus stop. Such mass release of people who enter the country illegally happens every day, multiple times, at multiple locations. At best, this is a mockery of U.S. immigration law and sovereignty, and at worst, it is a huge national security and community safety risk. In addition to many Chinese with connections to the Communist Party, People's Liberation Army, and other state entities, it is statistically probable that DHS is releasing people with criminal records. According to U.S. law, DHS should detain aliens caught entering illegally, but the Biden administration has replaced border control with mass processing and release, and they have abused immigration parole at an unprecedented scale. In January 2021, the Border Patrol encountered 17 Chinese between ports of entry. This year in January, it was 3,700. I won't repeat the rest of the numbers, but we're close to 50,000 already this fiscal year. Nearly all of them are being released into an asylum process that will take years to conclude, and then those eventually ordered removed are unlikely to be deported because the Chinese government does not cooperate in accepting their nationals. In fact, in fiscal year 2023, ICE removed a total of 288 Chinese, leaving up to 100,000 still in the U.S. despite final orders of removal. Most Chinese entering the U.S. illegally are seeking employment. They use asylum claims to enter, to remain, and to work. Illegal immigration ebbs and flows corresponding to a risk-reward calculation. And the reason that Chinese are coming in great numbers today is simply because they can. The worldwide awareness of our open border spread by social media shows them how. The Chinese have massive economic investments in Latin America. They have close ties with governments including Brazil, Cuba, and Venezuela. They don't need visas to fly to Ecuador, after which they can continue by land to the U.S. Tomorrow, May 17th, Air China begins direct flights from Beijing to Havana. Meanwhile, Chinese investments in the U.S., both legal and illegitimate, are growing, providing many new opportunities for work. More people are on the way. Now, overseas, an in-person interview by a consular officer is the first line of vetting for visa applicants. This is buttressed by staff who know local languages, customs, and news, and in larger embassies, we have other federal agencies who can assist with investigations. The second line of vetting is through automatic checks of U.S. government databases. Applicants are frequently refused visas due to adverse information that would not have been discovered had they simply showed up at the border with no identity documents. Meanwhile, at the border today, most so-called national security decisions of who gets into our country are no longer made by American officers. Under President Biden's policies, what was once a privilege has become a right. And despite what the administration wishes the public to believe, there is no real vetting of those released at the border, nor of those allowed in under parole programs, much less the gotaways who enter entirely without inspection. The official visa front door competes with a wide-open back door at the border, where there are no routine criminal background checks from the person's home country. Unless a foreign national has a record held by U.S. agencies, DHS is flying blind. Concerning China specifically, CBP agents have reportedly reduced the number of standard questions asked of inadmissible Chinese from 40 to 5, but however many the questions, the process relies on an alien telling the truth. Even if CBP requests additional information on a particular individual, China routinely ignores U.S. requests for verification of nationality, and they reportedly hide domestic records of criminal and corruption cases. DHS releases most aliens with a notice to appear in immigration court far in the future, and they're then free to go where they want with no easy way for ICE to find them. There are more than 6 million aliens on ICE's non-detained docket, of whom only about 184,000 are tracked, and only 2% of those with GPS monitors. To close this dangerous loophole, the U.S. needs to re-implement agreements with Mexico and Central America so that inadmissible aliens are not released into the interior pending the decision in their asylum cases. Given the population, economy, and politics of China, we can never meet the demand for those seeking to enter illegally. And at some point, the U.S. will either have to remove those who are ineligible to enter or remain, or else abandon the rule of law. Thank you.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes Mr. Singleton for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Chairman Bishop, Ranking Member Ivey, and distinguished members of this committee, thanks for the opportunity to testify about how the Chinese Communist Party stands to exploit America's border crisis to further its strategic interests and undermine U.S. national security. All told, the dramatic increase in Chinese nationals seeking to illegally enter the United States has reached unprecedented levels. Today's surge is not simply a matter of immigration, though. It's a multifaceted menace that mires our border management systems and magnifies major national security risks. The drivers of today's surge are complex. Economic instability and political repression within China have propelled many Chinese to seek better lives abroad. Yet this migration is also facilitated by sophisticated Chinese smuggling networks, readily accessible through Chinese social media platforms like WeChat and Douyin, China's version of TikTok. These and other platforms provide prospective migrants with detailed step-by-step guidance about how to enter our country illegally, as well as facilitate direct connections with human traffickers. Given that context, the security implications of today's border surge are profound and worthy of further inquiry. For starters, the influx provides cover for Chinese intelligence operatives or those acting on their behalf to potentially infiltrate our borders. These operatives benefit from newfound operational flexibility, insomuch as instability at the border allows them to evade traditional screening procedures at other American ports of entry. Furthermore, their diversification of tradecraft, using everything from false documentation to exploiting vulnerabilities in our border screening protocols, equips these individuals with a varied arsenal designed to overwhelm our defenses. Adding to these concerns are China's national security laws, including its 2017 National Intelligence Law and recently revised counter-espionage law, which require all Chinese citizens and organizations to support state intelligence activities. Coupled with China's well-documented history of conducting extraterritorial operations in the United States and elsewhere, these Chinese laws pose a significant threat, turning innocent individuals into tools of espionage under immense pressure from China's government. Amidst this orchestrated chaos, Chinese transnational criminal organizations are also ruthlessly exploiting our border vulnerabilities, fueling the fentanyl crisis that claims thousands of American lives each year, showcasing a sinister blend of state-sponsored subterfuge and underworld criminality. Beyond the clear security risks, China is also skillfully exploiting today's chaos to depict the U.S. as a faltering democracy, incapable of securing its borders. This narrative, projected globally, not only diminishes our international standing, but also bolsters China's robust efforts to undermine Western democratic values. All the while, China's government remains intent on obscuring the reality that its own citizens are fleeing China in search of freedom and opportunity elsewhere. In response to today's threats, we must not only do more to secure our borders, but also strengthen our diplomatic ties and enhance our technological capabilities. These efforts should be complemented by targeted legislative actions that provide the necessary tools and resources to combat these threats effectively. A coordinated response must include everything from enhancing our border security infrastructure, improving interagency collaboration, and boosting our intelligence capabilities to preempt and dismantle the networks facilitating these illegal migration flows. Washington must also intensify its public diplomacy and counter-propaganda efforts to correct Beijing's misleading narratives. Such work is particularly important in light of a recent speech Chinese Communist Party Chairman Xi Jinping delivered to party elites, in which he remarked, quote, "The most important characteristic of the world is, in a word, chaos, and this trend appears likely to continue," end quote. In that same speech, Xi Jinping noted, quote, "The times and trends are on our side." As we consider these and other measures, let us remember that the stakes are exceptionally high. The integrity of our borders, the safety of our citizens, including Asian Americans and Chinese Americans, and the stability of our global standing are all intertwined with how we handle this growing crisis. I look forward to working together and developing bipartisan solutions that not only address the current challenges we face, but also reinforce our national resilience against all forms of geopolitical manipulation and repression. On behalf of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, I thank you again for inviting me to testify today.
Thank you, Mr. Singleton. I now recognize Dr. Oyen for 5 minutes for opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Bishop, Ranking Member Ivey, and the members of the subcommittee for the invitation to share some historical context to the current increased levels of Chinese immigration. My name is Meredith Oyen. I'm an associate professor of history at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, as well as the director of the Asian Studies program there. My research centers on the role that migrants play in the relationship between the United States and China, with particular focus on the period since the founding of the People's Republic in 1949. Recent Chinese history does provide some explanations for the demographics and increased numbers of Chinese migrants on the southern border. Motivations for Chinese migrants crossing the southern border include the slowing Chinese economy and tightening political control under President Xi Jinping. The pandemic and China's lengthy zero-COVID policy had important effects on the Chinese national economy that led to slower growth and increased discontent. Migrants who have talked and been interviewed at the border have cited the difficulty finding jobs and the impact of the pandemic on small business. Migrants also cite the tightening political control by President Xi Jinping that has led to political repression, police visits after making statements critical of the CCP or Chinese government, and a lack of freedom as reasons for leaving China. Specifically, in the last decade, increasing persecution of Chinese Christians and Muslims, along with limitations on the exercise of their faith, has led some Chinese to leave the country. The crackdowns against protests in Hong Kong and the new national security law implemented in 2020 has also led to the flight of former Hong Kong residents. The end of the zero-COVID policy in December of 2022 permitted more Chinese nationals to travel abroad than had been able to since the beginning of the pandemic. Modern information sharing through social media and online platforms has provided information about crossing the US southern border. As the number of people who cross successfully into the United States increases and they share their experiences, more individuals looking for a viable path follow in their footsteps. Recent reports have highlighted the demographics of the Chinese migrants. I wanted to add that before 1965, migration to the United States was dominated by men traveling alone. This was a result of the Page Act of 1875, which curtailed the migration of women, and cultural traditions in China that made international migration a risk only undertaken by men. More recently, unauthorized Chinese migration through container shipping, such as the Golden Venture incident that made headlines in the 1990s, was also dominated by men traveling alone. Like their predecessors, these men were not necessarily single, but they were traveling solo, hoping to pave the way for families that followed. Chinese immigrants, especially unauthorized immigrants, have long fallen under suspicion of having dangerous motives or being potential spies for a hostile foreign power. The Chinese became the first and only nation to be singled out in US immigration law with the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. The anti-Chinese movement that precipitated the act cited Chinese migration as a unique threat to the United States. These fears led to extreme violence against Chinese immigrants, including mob violence and the burning of Chinatowns. After 1949, Chinese nationals in the United States and visa applicants in Hong Kong faced suspicion and harassment from US authorities concerned about the national security risk they posed. US Consul Everett Drumright warned that the history of unauthorized entry, and particularly the history of lying about identities and lying about their background information, meant the entire population was rife for opportunities for spying for the newly communist government. The search for spies among Chinese immigrants and the Chinese American community had a chilling effect, and the community in the United States faced increased harassment and discrimination, with no real evidence of spying being found. During the 1990s, Taiwanese American scientist Wen-Ho Lee was arrested and held for over a year over espionage charges that never had enough clear evidence of a crime to bring charges against him. During the COVID pandemic, there were many documented instances of suspicion, harassment, and violence against Chinese Americans as their race and ethnicity became associated with the source of the pandemic that caused such significant economic and personal harm. Historically, there have been many examples of an impact of suspicion, broad suspicion, targeted specifically at Chinese Americans that have had detrimental effects for the community that is otherwise a very productive and useful community in the United States. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Oyen. I'll now recognize Mr. Bensman for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Hi, thank you for the privilege of having me here today. As I speak with you at this minute, Chinese nationals are illegally crossing our southwest border in historic numbers and preparing for their second crime, asylum fraud. They disfigure and toss their passports, like this one, because the stamps inside prove their holders passed through safe countries that would have granted protection. That would disqualify them for U.S. asylum. Likewise, they discard Mexican residency cards like these all over the U.S. side and the Mexican side, which the Mexicans require for them to move north because they show that Mexico already granted them protection, which is another disqualifier for asylum. A record-smashing 50,000 Chinese nationals have crossed the southern border since Biden entered office and stood up policies that mainline them into interior America within 48 hours. The Chinese people responded predictably to this unprecedented invitation. At current escalating rates, their numbers should hit 100,000 by 2024's end. All of China knows they'll be freed on personal recognizance for years and likely remain permanently. This administration tolerates mass illegal entry and asylum fraud, but we're here today because the administration seems equally accommodating to a direct national security threat this human flow poses. That would be China's relentless economic and political espionage campaigns, thievery of cutting-edge defense technologies, and dissident suppression operations against our citizens and legal residents. To be sure, most of those 50,000 Chinese nationals are merely coming to work and enjoy America's famed lifestyle. But there can be little doubt that Beijing's spy masters also noticed right away when a welcome wagon greeted the first of its 50,000 citizens that America's new president had just opened a new superhighway over the U.S. southwest border, tailor-built to carry intelligence operatives. U.S. counterintelligence agencies must assume Beijing is already injecting agents into this flow. Recent spy prosecutions in the U.S. and public intelligence community assessments tell us this threat is not speculative. The prosecutions revealed that young 20-something agents got in by exploiting U.S. student and cultural exchange visas. They heisted our secrets from inside elite U.S. universities, research institutes, and corporations. It follows that the prosecutions put heat on legal visa abuses and drove up the risk of detection to China. Just when Beijing needed an alternative way to get its operatives in, the Biden government handed China the golden ticket. Warm greetings at the border and rapid releases with almost no questions asked. The U.S. intelligence community's own assessments tell us what's in store. China will remain the most aggressive espionage actor on U.S. soil and has big plans. Biden's own 2024 DHS threat assessment predicts much more than rapacious economic espionage. It says the CCP operatives will hunt down dissidents in America and will use, quote, physical assault, threats, harassment, defamation, and kidnapping out of country, read rendition, to, quote, suppress oppositional voices. Almost unbelievably, Beijing already has established inside the U.S. what the DHS assessment calls, quote, unsanctioned police stations, from which CCP operatives surveil and harass dissidents. And about those 50,000 non-spy economic migrants, can they all be regarded as entirely benevolent, asylum fraud aside? They're fodder for coerced recruitment by China. Office of Director of National Intelligence Assessments 2023 and 2024 say China is going to, quote, pressure families back home to recruit Chinese abroad as informants and operatives. As if quick releases after border crossings were not golden ticket enough, the Biden administration gifted the Chinese intelligence an especially sparkling new policy. Washington ordered Border Patrol to reduce the number of interview questions for incoming Chinese nationals from 40 to just 5, the Daily Caller has reported. Why? To move them into the country even faster, including those who tossed their identity documents and might as well have given their names as Mickey Mouse. Reporting indicates they've all learned to easily defeat the 5 questions and be shown the entrance door to America, which makes them all strangers, just the way Beijing's spy masters want it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bensman. I thank the witnesses for your valuable testimony. And let's see, where's my place? We've got, oh, I'm sorry, we're here. Members will be recognized by order of seniority for their 5 minutes of questioning. An additional round of questioning may be called after all members have been recognized. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. Professor Oyen, I think I'll start with you. You talked about risk, and in fact, Mr. Ivey opened his comments with commentary about risks of Asians being discriminated against or Chinese being discriminated against. And of course, we know that there's some very difficult history in the United States of that sort. So what of that? I mean, if you, what are you saying there? You've got, do you, let me just tick off some of the risks that have been specifically identified in other witnesses' testimony. I've always understood, and lots of evidence in this before this Congress indicates that China is engaged in very intensive economic espionage against the United States. We've heard testimony, or I recited in my opening statement about the aggressive Chinese money laundering operations in the United States. Mr. Bensman just made reference to, and news reports have been widespread, including one in North Carolina I heard about Chinese, quote, police stations, which are bent on intimidating, harassing, and in some cases, many awful things against folks of Chinese heritage in the United States. We've heard about cultural exchange programs in college campuses being used as Trojan horses for Chinese intelligence infiltration. So, and then if you've got a rapidly increasing population of Chinese migrants coming in irregularly. So what about all that? Should that be just ignored? Or is it a good thing, perhaps?
I would say neither. I'm suggesting that in the grand scheme of history, you can see that this kind of migration and these kinds of concerns have existed before, that this is the concerns about security risks from irregular migration are not new, that there are plenty of valid concerns about the relationship with China and the kinds of Chinese espionage that might be happening. I am saying, though, that I do not have any, I have not seen anything that suggests that this particular population is part of this espionage network, and I would, there's no definitive evidence one way or the other.
So do you think there needs to be definitive evidence in the case of every...
I think there needs to be, well, I mean, it's not up to me to say. I'm a historian, right? I'm not a policymaker. But because there's no definitive evidence either way, I would caution against this broad-scale assumption that people who are seeking asylum in the United States are in fact, spies coming to undermine it, when there are, in fact, very good other explanations, and there are also lots of historical precedents for that kind of rhetoric having very negative effects on the existing Chinese American community. So I think that the history leads us to have some caution in how we speak about this population coming in.
So is it a question of how we speak about it or what we're doing to vet them? Do you think they should be vetted intensively?
I think every immigrant who comes into the United States should be vetted, but that's part of the
I certainly agree with that, and they're not being. So let's say that aside. Would you say that there are additional risks with China as a global adversary of the United States that would warrant additional intensive vetting for Chinese migrants who are entering without legal authorization?
I think that historically we have seen that it is at periods of high tension between the United States and China, we have engaged in greater vetting. But we have also seen historically that the patterns of the people who are engaged with espionage have not been economic migrants, who are and in fact the 1950s era or even the 1900s era, people who the 1990s era migrants who came in by irregular means were not coming in that way. And I think that knowing that history is important.
Don't want to cut you off, but let me get to Mr. Bensman before we get done. How about that, Mr. Bensman? If I'm hearing from the ranking member and Professor Oyen, the idea is we really shouldn't say anything about this because it's going to be discriminatory. What about that? Why isn't that true? Or if it is true, what do you say about it?
Well, the U.S., excuse me, the U.S. Homeland Security enterprise, especially in dealing with the border, has for decades isolated particular nationalities based on our relations with their governments. For example, Iran. When we have immigrants from Iran hit the border, we will set them aside and bring in FBI and CIA and others to interview them to try to figure out, what they're about. Are they good? Are they fleeing the regime, or are they part of the regime? Are they a terrorist actor? North Koreans that hit the border, everybody can understand why a North Korean would want to leave North Korea, but we also know North Korea is a source of mischief all over the world, and they're sending their representatives. So we do separate certain nationalities as a matter of routine from all of the Middle Eastern countries, and it just depends on, but China most certainly we did all the way up until about last year.
Perhaps we'll have another round. I'm conscious of having overstayed my time. So, the ranking member, I'll no.
One more question?
Well, I think I will do.
We're not beating the.
I appreciate that, Mr. Ranking Member. Right, I appreciate it. Well, I appreciate it, and thank you for that indulgence. Let me follow it up in this way. I do think it's correct to say there is a nationality concern here that's predicated on a hostile relationship of governments that counsels additional concern. But let me just file this last question with maybe Mr. Bensman. I always hear from the Secretary of Homeland Security we have a global eruption of migration that accounts for all this. I don't, other than the possibility that maybe Mr. Hankinson asserted, and maybe I ought to direct the question to Mr. Hankinson. I'm not aware of any major change in China that would account for this sudden explosion of Chinese illegal migrants. And there's a lot of government, totalitarian control in that country, even in terms of people leaving the country. So is there something I'm missing? Is there some, chaos that's erupted in China that would account for this sudden change and magnificent, large change?
Well, I spend a lot of time with the immigrants. I've interviewed thousands of them. I've met Chinese. I can never get the Chinese to talk to me. I have an interpretation app, which is difficult anyway, but I don't think that they would want to talk to me. But what I gather from my interviews with many thousands of immigrants on their way here is that they're coming now because all their friends got in, all their relatives just got in. The border's open, we're going for it. Well, like, what if the Americans change their minds all of a sudden? And so there's this big rush on. And I have to say that the Chinese are probably no different. They're going to be looking for lifestyle upgrades. A lot of the Chinese that I meet on the trail seem very well resourced, very well put together. They don't seem like they're starving peasants. They often spend tens of thousands of dollars to make the journey. It's an opportunity for them. Now, the economy in China is not, as robust as it has been, but They can get in now.
Thank you, Mr. Bensman. And again, I thank the ranking member for his indulgence, and I will exercise similar indulgence, and I yield to, or I recognize Mr. Ivy for 5 minutes of questioning and whatever else that may go to.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. I want to separate the apples and oranges out here because we've got sort of two conversations about migration. One is the southwestern border, people crossing, like a lot of the other people coming from countries, Central American and the like. And the other is the economic espionage crowd, which, as I understand it, is not crossing at the border. These are people who are coming over on visas and the like. And the main difference, I'm told, I was just at a conference on AI where we were talking a lot about the competition between the United States and China and the concern that China's catching us and has passed us potentially on some of these areas with respect to AI and tech. Some of it's based on economic espionage. Some of it's also based on the fact that I think they have 5 times more engineers and computer scientists than the United States has, which is why we bring so many of them over. But one of the points that was made was that 38% of the tech scientists in the United States are from China. And those are not people who came here, that came across the border with no documents or falsified documents. They were people who were brought here by their companies. And in fact, if you talk to some of these companies, they'll tell you they're having trouble bringing people over. They need them because of the engineering and scientific expertise. They have trouble bringing them over because of the visa process here in the United States. And in some instances, they said, I talked to one VC leader who said that he was trying to bring somebody over from India. It took so long that what he did instead was he just set up a satellite company in Canada and started bringing him over there. And so, in some respects, it's not people coming over here too fast for these types of jobs here in the United States. They're not coming fast enough for these tech leaders who want to have them here. So I did want to make sure, and I don't know if I'm disputing what you said, Mr. Bensman, or not, but I think it's pretty clear cut that the people coming across the border who don't have, even if they have a technical background, if they don't have the documents, Microsoft's not going to hire them, Google's not going to hire them. They're not going to get those kinds of jobs. They're not going to be professors at Stanford or Harvard or wherever. You can't just come over here and show up one day and get those kinds of jobs. So the and that's where the economic espionage is happening. It's happening at that level. It's not happening at the level of people who are crossing the border. As I'm told by people who, A, work at the border, but also, more importantly, own and run those companies where they're complaining most loudly about the economic espionage. And so the focus they want us to make is in part focused on the Chinese government, which sponsors a lot of that activity, and also where's technology responses aimed at protecting the information in better ways and vetting internally to make sure the right people have the access to that information. Mr. Singleton, I think you mentioned something about tools for espionage as well with respect to, I guess, crossing at the southwest border. I would raise the same kind of questions that I did just a moment ago. But you also said something about things that Congress can do to address these problems, and I think I'm going to set aside the economic espionage piece for the reasons I just stated. I think you mentioned something about improving infrastructure for vetting and the like at the border. I wanted to give you a chance to elaborate on that.
Thank you very much. And I would agree with you that the vast majority of Chinese nationals who live and study in the United States stay and contribute to our communities. We also have to recognize, however, that there are large numbers, thousands of Chinese nationals who are coming here from China to study at our universities at the behest, direction, and with the sponsorship of the Chinese Communist Party in support of military-civil fusion and its broader strategy. So enhancing those established legal mechanisms to both vet at U.S. embassies and consulates to allow them in, but also recognizing the threat that exists in that legal immigration space is critical. I think many of the—
Well, let me ask you on how to bulk that up. How would you address that?
Having also been a former consular officer, I can acknowledge that the amount of time that you have to adjudicate a visa for a particular entrant is minuscule, sometimes 30 seconds or less to make a decision about a particular student. One of the things that needs to be done is a much broader understanding of the Chinese universities that are involved in military-civil fusion and adding additional scrutiny for those students. To give great examples, my alma mater, Texas A&M, used to maintain research partnerships with China's Ocean University, which is responsible for constructing Chinese military submarines. Other Chinese universities like Sichuan University develop China's nuclear weapons, and yet we allow high-level STEM-related research partnerships between those two schools that are wholly unregulated. As a consular officer, I am wholly unequipped to make a decision about whether that individual represents a threat. So it really does require us to recognize how China has tapped into its civilian university structure to, in effect, weaponize it.
And on that point, I appreciate you for letting me run over, Mr. Chairman. With respect to tech companies, so you mentioned the sort of the academic community. Are there similar sorts of issues with respect to the high-tech community as well?
There have been a number of documented instances in which that's occurred. But again, I do.
Give me an example.
Sure. I mean, I think that there have been several serious FBI indictments in the last 4 years that talk about the placement of Chinese nationals in high-tech companies, particularly in Silicon Valley, and then that those individuals are sending back research, not public information, back to Chinese individuals and universities. There is also occurring.
Let me stop you there. What did they not go through a vetting process, or?
I think it shows that our vetting process is currently inadequate, and that when those nationals do gain entrance in employment, there's no follow-on screening. For example, if a Chinese national from a Chinese military civil fusion university were to matriculate at a U.S. school with a major of political science, and then the next day change it to nuclear physics, there's no one monitoring that change in process, and so it's both pre and post facto screening that's.
Let me stick with the companies here for a second. So with respect to, I don't know, Microsoft, since they'll be here next week apparently, or in the next few weeks, are they hire somebody and they're not monitoring them, or they don't have internal controls with respect to protecting their confidential information? I mean,
We're talking about a completely haphazard process. Nothing is required in statute or required, and even today, Microsoft announced that it was moving thousands of its AI engineers outside of China, relocating them because of concerns about Chinese military civil fusion and the potential risks to losing critical cutting-edge technology because of Chinese espionage.
okay. All right, Mr. Chairman, thank you. I appreciate you for letting me run over.
I thank the ranking member, and one nit to pick, and I'll give you an opportunity to respond if I can before we go on. There was a comment in your opening statement, staff handed to me, that one of the sector chiefs gave that testimony that we treat everybody the same. It doesn't matter where you come from, it doesn't matter what your nationality is, what your religious beliefs are, we're going to treat everybody exactly the same. But then immediately below that, question was asked, do you know if any additional investigation or interviews are conducted on Chinese nationals in Yuma sector? Yes. And that they are? Yes, that they are. Why? And then I'm skipping a little bit here, but he says, I have sector intelligence unit agents that are assigned to the FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force team, and so FBI has expressed an interest in doing additional screening and interviews for Chinese nationals. I yield to the ranking member.
Well, just an observation. I appreciate that clarification for me and correction, but I thought our panel was just testifying a few minutes ago that you only get 5 questions when they're coming in, so I'm not sure which it is.
I'm not sure where it comes out either.
Yeah.
I think maybe we're in somewhat agreement, maybe we're in agreement, I'm not sure about if there's a need for more intensive vetting of Chinese nationals, and whether it's happening or not, I'm not totally clear. So I thank the ranking member again for the spirit of collegiality in which we do our subcommittee hearings, and may it extend to the rest of Congress. But with that, I'll recognize the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Ezell, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Over the past year, this committee has shown the failure of the Biden administration's open border policies. Under the president's watch, there have been over 8 million illegal aliens released into this country. What is not clearly revealed in the group of 8 million illegals is an alarming statistic. The fastest growing group crossing the border illegally is not from Mexico or South America, they're from China. Since President Biden has taken office, CBP encounters with Chinese nationals has risen over 4,200%. The CCP has targeted businesses, universities, and lawmakers in its efforts to undermine America. The thought that the CCP would not use an open border to their advantage is nonsense. Last year, President Biden's DHS released guidance that significantly reduced the vetting process of these Chinese nationals. The number of questions, what we talked about earlier, has gone from 40 to just 5. Mr. Hankinson, do you believe the Biden administration is making it any easier for the Chinese nationals to enter this country illegally?
Excuse me. Yes, I do. I think the charts and the graphs and the statistics are pretty clear that when people understand that they will be released once they arrive in the United States, as long as they express a credible fear and the intent to launch an asylum claim, and we do know that 85–90% of those claims are fraudulent, meaning that they're based on facts that just don't generate a claim for asylum that will be approved, then they come. And with social media, that's sort of greatly magnified exponentially the information that's getting back to countries all around the world. I think we're up to like 180 countries now that have been caught entering illegally at the border in the last few years. So when you say that you're not going to detain people, when you are releasing them on their own recognizance, when you're paroling them in, and when they know that the system will not be able to process them for years, then you send a clear signal and people understand it.
Thank you. Do you know what 5 questions that the Chinese nationals in the interview, do you know what the 5 questions are?
Well, I have a completely unconfirmed snapshot of what they are, and they're just basic questions about where you come from. Do you have any affiliation with the Chinese government? Did you pay for your trip to the United States? Did you pay a smuggler? Have you got any prior arrests? A shortened version of the form that visa applicants have to answer, where they're supposed to say, I don't have a criminal record, I'm not a member of the Nazi Party or the Communist Party, and so on.
So they just check it off, so there's no real verification whether they're telling the truth or not.
There's absolutely no way to verify. If someone at the border says, I don't have a criminal record, we don't have the criminal records of China easily accessible. And if we asked the Chinese for them, they wouldn't give them to us, I'm pretty sure, unless it was someone that they wanted back, for example, a dissident.
When we do obtain any information and run it throughout the internal databases, do you know if China's providing any information on the aliens? Do you know if they're doing any of that?
You're asking if the Chinese share their, as far as I know, no. We have countries in the visa waiver program that do share criminal records with us that can be checked automatically. But as far as I'm aware, there's no automatic data sharing with China of either fact data or bio data.
Do you have any opinion about President Biden and his policies? Is this putting America at a greater risk?
I think statistically it's undeniable. If you have 50,000 additional people and you have no confirmation of their background, their criminal records, their past affiliation or present affiliation with the government or any of its entities, I think it's almost certain that a proportion, probably very small, but a proportion of them are coming here with the intent to, at some point, do some harm.
Do you have any examples of any of these bad actors that have entered the country illegally?
Well, one recent example that struck me was in March of this year in 29 Palms in California, there was a Chinese man who I think had crossed the border illegally and been released, who attempted to get onto the military base. And at the time, the local headlines, the local press said he was confused and he said he was lost, he didn't know where he was going. And I wrote at the time in an op-ed that, geez, if you were going to try to scope out a base and try to get some basic intel and figure out what the security procedures were at U.S. military bases, what better way than to send some, excuse me, but a doofus. But then I later found out that there have been over 100 of these incidents by Chinese nationals in the past few years, according to a source quoted by the Wall Street Journal. So one time, maybe, but 100 times starts to seem a little bit more like a pattern.
Pretty obvious. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for yielding back, and I now recognize the gentlelady, Ms. Ramirez, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Chairman and Ranking Member. I want to start by expressing my disappointment that this committee still allows special witnesses from an organization that's been designated as a hate group for publishing the works of white nationalists. Mr. Bensman, yes or no, have you ever used or invoked invasion rhetoric or language when referencing migrants? Okay, well, let me ask you a follow-up. Is your Twitter handle @BentzmanTodd, correct? Okay, so I want to show you here something. As you can see, I have a number of your Twitter posts here, and it's not hard to find examples of you or someone who's doing a good job pretending to be you, uplifting the same invasion rhetoric central to the white nationalist and anti-Semitic Great Replacement conspiracy theory. Let me read just one of them. Border invasion series. Or let me read one more. Benjamin says, Biden administration rechanneled migrant waves to hide invasion at southern border. Folks, no one from a hate group should ever be invited to provide testimony before this committee. It hurts our integrity as a committee. And it's why, as I'm sitting here, I'm going to direct my questions to an actual expert. The Department of State's 2023 Human Rights documents that significant human rights issues in China include credible reports of unlawful killings, forced disappearances, torture, and arbitrary detention by the Chinese government, forced labor, and genocide against ethnic minorities. So my question is to Dr. Oyen. It seems Chinese nationals seeking humanitarian relief have plenty to fear. Can you briefly speak to the human rights conditions and risks in China? Let me specifically ask you, how has the Chinese government increased repression of its citizenry under President Xi?
There's been a tightening of control since 2012 when President Xi first took power, and in the recent years since he has become a essentially permanent leader, that has increased as well. And we've seen this. There's the long-standing the longer history of the persecution of the Uyghur people, but there's also been very specific examples of Chinese and Muslim adherents to their faith not being permitted to worship in the ways that they choose. There's also been persecution of people who were part of something that's called the Chinese Democratic Party. There was a period of open flourishing of ideas where people created ideas and started talking about future plans for China and ways in which the Chinese government might serve people. And the people who were part of that party and who were engaged in that have been largely subject to a crackdown where they have been arrested and harassed for their beliefs, and in some cases have successfully sought asylum. And so there's also just built into this last decade, 12 years of Xi Jinping's rules, there's been a tightening of laws and control over the extent to which people can talk freely about the government, the ways that they criticize the government. There's been tightening of internet controls. There already existed, right? But there's continuing cracking down on internet controls. So certainly there are examples of the government being authoritarian and being hard on civilians, such as that they might decide that they can't live their lives or they can't live their lives free of repression.
Thank you, Dr. Oyen. And it seems to me, I mean, based on your testimony and even seeing what you submitted, that we have to take seriously that there are Chinese nationals that are fleeing oppressive regimes. They're seeking refuge and humanitarian relief. And that those who flee authoritarian China are no different than all of those who flee oppressive regimes. Some of those asylum seekers were the ancestors of the people that are in this room right now. And it's unacceptable that in the middle of celebrating the contributions of our Asian American and Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander communities, here we are with rhetoric about Chinese immigrant invasion. I'm not surprised, however, because a century ago, the United States enacted the Immigration Act of 1924, a law that heavily influenced by racist beliefs that closed the door on immigration from Asia, building on the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. And here we are in this committee now. So with that on record, Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Strong, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to talk more about the points Mr. Ezel mentioned. Mr. Bensman, most of the Chinese migrants that illegally enter the United States at the southwest border are first-timers, and therefore they do not have any flags in the U.S. criminal database. The CCP does not share criminal information with U.S. law enforcement. I'll emphasize, unless our intelligence agencies have a reason to flag a migrant, all CBP can do is rely on a migrant story. Most Chinese migrants state that they are here to claim asylum or for economic reasons. For a national security perspective, is relying only on a migrant's word enough to determine whether the migrant came to the United States with nefarious intent? What types of risk does this blind reliance pose?
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to recommend a book to Ms. Ramirez, Making Hate Pay by Tyler O'Neill, The Corruption of the Southern Poverty Law Center. I also want to tell you, Ms. Ramirez, that as far as, I don't know what you have on your board, I'd like to study it. There is no hateful anti-Semitic speech in my Twitter feed. I am Jewish, and we don't really get with white nationalists. That's not our thing. So get your facts straight. As far as your...
Mr. Chairman, he's referring to me, so I just wondered if I'm going to...
Gentleman's time from Alabama.
Thank you, sir. Let's go back to that question. What type of risk does the blind reliance pose?
What type of risk does...
What type of risk does this blind reliance related to national security, just if they tell us they're great people, that's what we're doing at our border right now. Oh, I want to come to America. What does this pose whenever they say, come on in?
Well, it's the ultimate stranger danger at the border. That's our problem with having mass migration at these historic levels. We can't know who anyone is. We can't really go to the Chinese, as I think my colleague said, for an intel share. We can't go to really very many countries at all for an intel share.
Thank you. What ways can CBP potentially reduce that risk?
Well, there's not a whole lot they can do. They'll run text database checks. They'll maybe run some criminal history checks, and then they'll let them in. But if they haven't been in the United States to commit crimes in the past, there's not going to be, they're going to come up with a negative, right? It'll be a big blank. So you just have to kind of take their word for it. A lot of them, like I said, dump their ID documents, their passports, and say, my name's Mickey Mouse.
Okay. I know that Russia was invaded Ukraine, and the Ukrainians defended itself. Hamas invaded Israel, and Israel defended itself. United States is being invaded, and I think that's the right word, by 160 different countries. And this administration has done nothing. 10 million illegal aliens coming across the border. And I'll say this again. This fentanyl is going to kill a generation of Americans. It's not a Republican issue. It's not a Democratic issue. It's an American issue. And I'll also bring up what's happening right now at the border. Border security, for every drone they're flying, the Mexican cartel's flying 17. They're coming into U.S. airspace, bringing fentanyl 60, 80, 100 pounds at a time, and we're doing nothing. Killing a generation of Americans. You mentioned some of the questions that are asked. You know, it's almost comical, the questions. You know, why don't they ask them what kind of chewing gum do they like, or their favorite city in America, or their favorite color, because they're getting the intelligence of the questions they're asking is about as important as that. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentlelady from New York, I believe, right? Ms. Clark.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I thank our ranking member. I want to yield some time to my colleague, Ms. Ramirez of Illinois.
Thank you, Congresswoman Clark. Just to follow up, from the remarks that the witness just made. So I said the organization, and then I said your tweets, and we will be happy to give you a printout. There's so many of them, so you'll have an opportunity to read them closely after committee. But I want to make sure that, Mr. Chairman, I want to enter this into the record, which is a article from the Southern Poverty Law Center that ranks immigrant studies as one of the white nationalist organizations.
I object.
Okay, well, then let me see if I can enter this court record here that, where the Center for Immigration Studies filed a case against the Southern Poverty Law Center, but the courts actually found this to, they dismissed the motion because there was not enough information to be able to determine that they had a case against them.
Mr. Chairman, I would move to include in the record both of the documents that the gentlelady from Illinois has offered.
It's been so moved. Is there a motion to table?
Motion.
Motion before, there's no debate on that motion. All in favor of the motion to table, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All opposed, say no.
No.
Oh,
The motion, I hear the motion to have been approved, and the
I would ask for a recorded vote, Mr. Chairman.
recorded vote. All in favor, let's see, clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Chairman, I did yield my time to Ms. Ramirez. Since we're going through this process, I hope that my time will be restored.
I would ask the chair to pause the clock at where it was stopped.
Appears to me the clerk paused the clock at 3:15, which I assume is pursuant to rule.
It was actually about 4 minutes.
When the objection was.
If they're able to establish what the time was, I have no problem with putting it back as it was, but the request was not made until now, of course. About what?
Well, let's do the vote, but I would suggest to the chair that we've been fairly flexible on time, going both ways today.
I concur about that.
All right, thank you.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Green of Georgia. Sorry, Ms. Green of Georgia. Mr. Zell. Mr. Strong. Mr. Strong. Mr. Strong votes aye. Mr. Crane. Mr. Ivy. Mr. Ivy votes no. Mr. Tanadar. Mrs. Ramirez.
no.
Mrs. Ramirez votes no. Ms. Clark.
No.
Ms. Clark votes no.
Chairman votes no.
Mr.
Excuse me,
Bishop.
Chairman votes aye.
Mr. Bishop votes aye.
Clerk will report.
On that vote, Mr. Chairman, there were 2 ayes and 3 noes.
Motion to table fails. The motion before the committee is the motion of the gentlewoman, or the motion of the gentleman to ranking member to admit the item into the record. All in favor will say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. Noes have it.
Ask for a recorded vote.
Recorded vote is ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Green. Mr. Ezell. Mr. Strong. Mr. Strong votes no. Mr. Crane. Mr. Ivy. Mr. Ivy votes aye. Mr. Tanadar. Mrs. Ramirez.
Aye.
Mrs. Ramirez votes aye. Ms. Clark.
Aye.
Ms. Clark votes aye.
Chairman votes no.
Chairman Bishop votes no.
Clerk will report.
On that vote, Mr. Chairman, there were 3 ayes and 2 noes.
The motion is adopted, and the item will be received into the record. The time is with the gentlelady of New York.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. We're here today because Republicans are demagoguing and exploiting the xenophobic and white supremacist ideologies that are fueling the immigration debate in this nation. And for those who are showing up at our border, I am concerned about how we as a nation are going to address what is basically a broken immigration system. People don't choose to leave their families and communities, their culture, their language on a whim. Most often, people leave because their very lives are at stake. Just 700 miles from our border, the nation of Haiti is facing an unprecedented crisis. Gangs control their capital city, Port-au-Prince, and everyday citizens are being terrorized by brutal murderers and kidnappings. Millions of Haitians face food insecurity, and given the choice between starvation and violence and illicit migration, it is little wonder that people arrive at our borders. Though conditions in China are very different, it is never easy for an individual to choose to migrate. And I believe that we as a nation, particularly a nation of immigrants, have an obligation to bring our immigration system into the 21st century so that we can live up to the creed of our nation. Dr. Owen, what can you tell us about the demographics of the Chinese border crossers and why they're leaving China and how they integrate into communities in the United States once they arrive?
Based on what's been reporting so far, there's a lot of the reporting seems to be that they are from China's expansive middle class. You will see that there are people who have spent a couple thousand equivalents of US dollars to make the trip, and they have a harrowing journey through Ecuador and through the Darien Gap and up. And there's people who spent tens of thousands of dollars, which usually allowed them to fly the entire way to Tijuana and then cross the border. The reason why that sort of expansive middle class seems to be the population that's moving, it's people who have something to sell to have the money to do that, but it's also people who have been particularly severely hit by the zero COVID policies and the economic fallout from the pandemic. And so there is a lot of small business owners who have lost their businesses or have lost jobs or don't see the kinds of jobs that they're looking for or don't see opportunities available to them. And so that becomes an argument for economic migration in this way. So the demographics do appear to be predominantly people traveling alone and predominantly male based on the numbers who are coming into Ecuador, which has visa-free entry from China. And so it does appear to be that's the population that is most likely out of work, that very often can't find, is not happy in China. In some cases, there's demographic changes in China that make more men than women. And then, of course, there's historical reasons why Chinese men have usually undertaken risky immigration journeys.
Very well. Mr. Chairman, I really think that as a Committee on Homeland Security, we have an obligation to really bring our immigration laws into the 21st century and do it in a bipartisan manner. I hope that you'll be a proponent for that going forward and in the future. Having said that, thank you for the opportunity. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman yields back, and Chair now recognizes Mr. Higgins for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My colleagues across the aisle, I'm just visiting this subcommittee today, and I appreciate being here. I don't have the right to vote because I'm not on this subcommittee. I sit on another. But I would have voted in support of my Republican colleagues today. Let the historical record reflect that fact. Let me also state that my Democrat colleagues across the aisle appear to be saying to Americans across the country that have endured border policies enacted on the day that President Biden was inaugurated. It began as actions, executive actions, to change the policy of this country, to open our border. It wasn't the cartels that changed on January the 20th of 2021. It was the President of the United States. It wasn't the 1,954 miles of our border that changed in January 2021. It was the President of the United States. Changed our policies. And the world was listening, was it not, Mr. Bensman, as you pointed out. So Americans that have endured 15 million illegals crossing in our country in 4 years, crime waves rolling across America from sea to shining sea, fentanyl poisoning, killing 100,000 Americans per year. Americans across the country that have an objection to that, and we got a problem with that. Apparently, the Democrats are saying we're all a bunch of Nazis, white supremacists, anti-Semitic. That's like disconnected from reality, man. America is suffering generational trauma because of the Biden administration policies that have blown our border wide open. And now we got Chinese of means, Chinese healthy and well-funded coming into our country, being granted what? Asylum. He's a healthy, well-funded, warrior-age young man coming into our country. Nobody over there has a problem with that? Mr. Bensman, you mentioned interviewing thousands, you said. That's quite a lot. I would say that places you in the expert category, sir. How can we confirm who these Chinese nationals rolling across our southern border, thousands at a time now? How can we confirm? How do we know who they are? They tell us, they give us a name, they give us some documentation, but they're healthy, they're well-funded. They could buy documentation anywhere, quality documentation. How do we know who they are? Are we taking any biometric data from them? Are we getting any documentation, DNA, fingerprints, retinal scans, photographs, etc.?
There should be biometrics taken at different points along the trail. I'm sorry, there should be biometrics collected at different points along the trail in Panama, for example, Costa Rica, if they go through those.
At a processing center.
Yeah, through the. if they
Talking
go
about
through
at a
those points.
DHS-run processing center in another country. But does the United States or DHS have possession, from your experience of interviewing these thousands of illegal immigrants, does the United States have files on these people, who they are, fingerprints, retinal scans, et cetera?
I would say in general, they do not. They'll have, and especially they'll have maybe a first fingerprint from somewhere along the trail. They may take them at the border once they get here, but they don't really have anything to bounce them off against.
Okay.
The real.
So these Chinese nationals coming into our country, from your experience, or that maybe anyone can answer this, are they being reviewed for gang affiliations and gang tattoos, triad tattoos, et cetera?
Currently,
I see a no.
Currently, no.
Mr. Singleton. Dr. Oyen, do you know if these Chinese nationals are at least, being looked at for tattoos coming into our country?
I would not know that, no.
Don't know. Mr. Hankinson, are they being checked?
I wouldn't think they have the time to do a whole lot of checking, given how quickly they're being released.
Take your shirt off, 10 seconds, tattoos, yes or no? We do it in jails across the country every day at the local, state, and federal level. We look for tattoos, gang tattoos. We could do it at the border if we wanted to, without hiring one more agent or spending one more penny. Take your shirt off. Do you have tattoos? Yes or no? It's simple. We do it at jails across the country. Are we doing that, Mr. Bensman?
I would say not
The
really.
answer is no. The answer is no. Well, my goodness, I've expired my time, Mr. Chairman, but I have not expired my passion. Thank you. I yield.
The gentleman yields back. I had some indication, inkling that we might proceed to a second round of questioning, but I don't believe, in light of the way the turn of the hearing, that we'll do that. I started off with great optimism about the nature of the hearing, but it's unfortunate. I will say it is amazing that the person injecting the acrimony is one of the 9 Democrats to vote against a resolution condemning the October 7th attack. Also voted present on a resolution to bar Hamas members and those who participated in October 7th attack from entering our country. Astonishing. I will thank the witnesses for your valuable testimony and the members for your questions. Members of the subcommittee may have additional questions for the witnesses, and we would ask the witnesses to respond in writing. Pursuant to the committee rule 7D, the hearing record will be open for 10 days. With that, hearing is adjourned.